Buongiorno, good morning. Today we have the pleasure to talk to Sir Paul Nurse, recipient of the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2001 and at present director of the Francis Crick Institute in London and former president of the Royal Society. Good morning, Professor Nurse.
Good morning, Gabriel, but please call me Paul.
Thank you, Paul. It's really a pleasure to be in your presence. So let's talk about your book, What is Life? Why did you decide to write this book and to address to a wide audience?
Well, I think I decided to do that by going often to my local bookshop and looking at the popular science books. And what I realized was this, that there were often books, particularly in physics, that talked about the major discoveries in physics that people were, that the scientists were sure of, and where we have discussions of Einstein and relativity and quantum mechanics and so on. But in biology, we didn't focus so much on the great ideas of biology. We tended to have popular books that were always looking into the future. That is, this discovery is likely to lead to a new medicine in 5 years or 10 years and so on down the line. And quite often these things didn't really come to fruition. And I wanted to write a book which dealt with the principles of biology, as I saw them at least, and that we were going to be certain of. In other words, if we read it 30 years from now, everything I would say was likely to be mostly right. And that to try and communicate that to a popular audience, because I don't think they were being told about what we really knew about as against what might be happening in the future. So I think that was the major driving force for me to write it. And I had in the back of my head a sort of interested 15-year-old or 16-year-old who perhaps is interested in science, maybe not, who would pick it up. But then also a little bit further back in my head, anybody who had an interest in the world, the natural world around them. So it was really a popular audience I was trying to address, but with real focus on the ideas that we were confident would still persist 20, 30 years from now.
So you write about life, and now, as we know, we are in the grips of a global healthcare crisis. But in your opinion, why Western countries were not prepared to face it?
Well, this is a difficult question, and one I think we will, in the Western democratic nations, be discussing for some time forward, because we haven't done well. And I have to conclude that the major reason was that we were simply unprepared. And there was a complacency, perhaps, that the strength of our research and the strength of our research, which is very, very strong in the West, would cope with something like a pandemic. But it didn't take very much thinking about it to realize that because a pandemic disturbs the whole way society operates, and because you have to make very rapid decisions, that the only way to deal with it was if you were fully prepared, which we were not. And I can talk about the UK, which I'm familiar with. We had done various studies in the past looking at a potential pandemic, particularly an influenza one, and conclusions were made that we weren't prepared, and then nothing was done about it. And maybe the scientists and medics didn't make enough fuss. Maybe the politicians didn't pay enough attention because they thought, well, this is something we have to dream about in the future, but we don't have to worry about it now. I'm just not sure what the reasons were. So one is a lack of preparation. The second is, I think, our our societies have struggled with this and this is less scientific and more political, have struggled with this because we're asking society, people, to do things like socially distance and wear masks and accept vaccination, which some think impinge on their personal liberties. And they have thought less about the society as a whole and just more about their individual freedoms. And as a consequence of that, we've seen what can only be described as face mask wars. That was particularly the case in the United States, of course, which really made no sense because it was clear, even if that there had been no clinical trials, that if you had a respiratory virus, that covering your mouth and nose up could be positive, and we shouldn't wait around 3, 4, 5, 6 months to test whether that was the case. And yet the whole thing became a political weapon, that if you wear a mask, you're one political party. If you don't wear a mask, you're another political party. And that was crazy. Now, if we compare with the East, for example, in China, in other countries, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and so on, these areas did really quite a lot better than we did, partly because they were prepared, because they had suffered epidemics in related viruses over the years before, so they knew how difficult it could be to deal with. So even quite poor countries like Vietnam initially did really quite well. And secondly, they were more prepared to obey social rules about social distancing and masks and so on, because they lived in more regulated societies like China, or were more respectful of their neighbors in the communities in which they lived. And that resulted in a different outcome too. So those would be my observations. But frankly, I think this will require quite a lot of thinking and heart searching, primarily to think more clearly about how in Western democracies, with a respect for personal freedoms, we can relate to science and technology, which is complicated to analyze, and come to the best decisions and implement how things should go ahead for that society as a whole. And I would look upon this as one of the great challenges of the coming years that we in the West have to deal with.
Are we bound to have new pandemics in the close future?
I think we are bound to have new pandemics in the future. I think it's very difficult to know whether it will be quickly or not. What I can comment is that our world is so globalized that and people are being transported across the globe in hours or at most a day, that the risks of spreading rapidly are now much higher than they would have been 50 or 70 or 100 years ago. So that is going to increase the risk. Another factor that will increase the risk, which the experts are discussing, is that as our population is growing and we impinge more and more on the natural world, mixing with animals, normally wild animals that would have been more isolated, then viruses that are found in those animals are more likely to transfer to humans. It's just increases the risk of that. And that's almost certainly what happened with this coronavirus. And so I think that's going to increase the risk as well. And some, of course, argue that climate change, which will also disturb the natural world and human societies within it, may also affect this as in addition. So I think overall, I would say definitely we will have epidemics and pandemics, and I think they will increase in frequency. So it is more likely that it will happen more regularly than perhaps it has done in the past.
In your book, you write extensively about cells and DNA, but what's the real role of viruses in the process of life?
Well, I briefly discuss viruses because the objective of my book was, as I've already explained, was to talk about the great ideas of biology and then use those ideas to generate a definition of life. And I specifically spend a few pages discussing viruses because they live in this borderland between living things, which are obviously living, like ourselves, and non-living things, like a stone, for example, which obviously isn't alive. And viruses are living things in the sense that they can undergo evolution by natural selection, as we're seeing at the moment with resistant viruses arising. And that's one of the basic characteristics of life. But they're not independently living. They only can grow and reproduce inside the cell of another living organism. So they occupy this confusing borderland that they seem to be alive when they're inside another cell, and they have characteristics of life, including the ability to reproduce themselves and to undergo evolution by natural selection. But when they are outside the cell, they become inert, and they in fact become really like a crystalline chemical. And so trying to work out whether they are living or not has been complicated. In my book, I suggest, for example, that maybe what we should do is think about them as being alive when they're in another cell and essentially not alive when they're outside. Another point I make to try and think about viruses is we should fully recognize that we are, every living thing on the planet is dependent upon other living organisms in various ways. I mean, even us humans, we depend on obviously other living things to eat, plants and animals. We have many other living organisms, bacterial ones, that live on us or within us, some of which are performing important roles for us. So what that means is that every living thing nearly always is interacting and dependent upon other living things. In the case of a virus, that is extreme, very extreme, in that it can only grow and reproduce in another cell. In the case of an organism like ourselves, we're still dependent, but it is not so extreme. So that introduces the concept that there's a gradation from complete dependency, like a virus, to partial dependency like our cells. So they're the two observations I would make about viruses and their relationship to other life forms and whether they are alive or not.
And now the coronavirus is mutating very fastly, and some experts think that we could never reach the so-called herd immunity. What's your opinion about that?
Well, I think that we may not meet complete immunity across the population. I don't know whether that's the case, but I do think that with proper production of vaccines that can respond to these mutated viruses, that the threat of the virus will be very significantly reduced. I've mentioned already influenza flu. Influenza changes and mutates a lot, which means that when we get our yearly vaccination, which many of us receive, that is a vaccine that responds to the new variants that have been formed. Now, it turns out the coronavirus doesn't mutate that fast, but because it's infected so many people across the world, that means that there is variations occurring. And what we have to do is to be very conscious of those variants. We have to become aware of them by sequencing the virus, which, for example, we do in this institute here, and then we can predict what vaccines are needed. And the new vaccine technologies that we're seeing have been put in place with a number of the vaccines that are being used across the world now, they are vaccines that can be produced very quickly, changed very quickly, and then produced reasonably quickly. And so with a proper management of this, which I'm sure will involve the World Health Organization ultimately, we should be able to produce vaccines that will protect the world. But it's very important in thinking about this to realize that, that no country is an island. And it's no good that we have a good protection in Italy or the UK, for example, if we're constantly being invaded by new mutated viruses from the rest of the world. So this is a global responsibility that we can produce a way of working that will protect the world. And that's going to require a political solution that, again, we've not really fully grasped, but it will be important if we are going to get close to herd immunity.
We got many vaccines and many others are coming. But why, in your opinion, it's so difficult to get an effective therapy against this virus?
Well, we've been talking about vaccination, which gives you protection from being infected. And what you're bringing up is also the ability to get therapies that will control infection. In other words, that can fight the virus chemically. And there has been some advances there. We've seen, for example, the use of certain drugs that influence the immune system, which can control, at least in part, the response of the immune system to the virus, which, when it's very active, is one way in which the virus is causing severe health problems. So I think what we will see over the next year or two is a very extensive survey of drugs that have been used against other viruses or against the immune system to test what might be effective. And I'm already reading that various companies are looking into this. So my prediction, and it's no more than a prediction, is over the next year or two, in addition to having vaccines that will respond to the mutations that are arising, we will also gradually develop an armory of some drugs which will be able to either reduce the severity of the disease or maybe drop it, stop it altogether. So I am moderately optimistic that a combination of vaccination and new drugs will put this particular coronavirus under control.
And talking about organisms and cells, many people are scared by the idea of manipulating life, for example, in order to get better crops in agriculture or to fight cancer. What's your opinion about that?
Well, I think we have to consider very seriously using such techniques and technologies. You're quite right. There is an aversion, a sort of an instinctive response from at least some people that we shouldn't be genetically modifying other organisms. Although, of course, we do it quite a lot. And in fact, the new vaccines we're talking about genetically modify the viruses. So we do use genetic modification and people are not so worried about it. I think what they are mostly worried about is two things really: genetically modifying human beings and genetically modifying the food that we eat. Let's deal with human beings first. Genetically modifying human beings, when it's used as a therapy for a disease like cancer or whatever, then it's not so different from just having a drug that would be also effective in that disease. And I think that we will increasingly see that happening. To modify a fertilized egg, so you change every gene in the baby that's produced, is altogether a more difficult thing to talk about. One is whether we understand enough to do it properly, and my view is that we don't at this present point in time, but that's one thing. But let's imagine that it is safe. Should we do it? Again, my view would be that when you have a simple disease, simple in the sense that it can be caused by just one mutation, like cystic fibrosis, that it really would be amoral not to help people who will suffer that disease if we can repair it by genetic modification. So those that are against genetic modification must think about the suffering of those who have these genetic diseases, which in principle one might be able to cure. But when we think of using genetic modification for, let's call it cosmetic purposes, because you want somebody who's tall or got blue eyes or whatever, that seems to me just too trivial for us to sort of consider. And I'm personally not in favor of that. And when we get to even higher order functions, like being a musician, it's almost ridiculous because we don't really fully understand how somebody who's a good musician, how that comes about. And the notion that you can change it genetically at this moment in time, we simply don't know how to do it. And what you might do is influence other things which you don't want to influence. So that's human modification. Talking about modification of crops, we have methods that are so precise that we can specifically alter a particular gene and which could increase productivity or increase the growth of plants in marginal climates or marginal environments. If we can improve food sustainability and reduce starvation, for example, again, morally, that's something we have to think about. And there is an inconsistency here. Most of the plants that we eat now have been produced by just randomly mutating the DNA by hitting them with X-rays or a chemical mutagen. And yet that is acceptable, yet genetically modifying them very precisely is not. And if you look at the rules, for example, that are used at the moment in European Union countries, it's much more difficult to do the more precise changes than to do these random changes. And that just makes no sense whatsoever. So we really do have to look at this problem, in my view, very seriously, because we have a responsibility to help the poor and those that are not well fed in the world. And if we can use genetic modification to do it, then there is no reason not to do it. And indeed, it's immoral not to do it. I mean, if I was starving somewhere and was prevented from having a crop which had been genetically modified, I wouldn't be very happy with that. And I think those who argue that we shouldn't do it don't fully recognize that.
Paul, you had one of the most important research centers in the world, and you are a very famous geneticist. Do you think that one day everybody will have his or her own DNA sequenced, recorded, and analyzed in order to have a better and healthier life?
I do think that. I think that there is a consequence to that, which is worth thinking about. That I think it's really only compatible with a publicly delivered healthcare system, free at the point of delivery. And I want to explain why I say that. The first thing is knowing your sequence and knowing that you may have a predisposition to a disease or that you should take special care about being exposed to too much sun or eating certain foods or whatever, it will be very useful for your long-term health. So knowing your sequence will be quite important. But knowing your sequence means that you will also know whether you are likely to suffer some significant disease, and that has to be handled with great care. So that's the first issue, and we really haven't quite got to the bottom of that. But secondly, and this is the important point, the healthcare systems that are delivered upon in an insurance basis would be have a problem dealing with this, because if you had a genetic defect that meant you were likely to have a debilitating disease from the age of 20 onwards, then an insurance system would very quickly say, well, we should charge this person a lot more money for insuring them. Whereas if somebody has a healthy set of genes, they could be cheaper. Now, that I think is going to lead to an unequal healthcare delivery system. And it's completely eliminated if we just say that healthcare delivery is a responsibility of a civilized society. So I think that the benefits to be obtained from the genome sequence will be highly significant, but their delivery will be dependent upon having a more freer healthcare delivery system. And I don't think politically we've discussed this fully enough.
And how far is science from gaining a final victory on cancer? Yes, well, we're always having little victories, if I can put it that way. And compared for when I started working as a researcher in my 20s, we can now treat, to some extent, many more cancers. So it is improving. But there's no magic cure. You won't be able to manage cancer in the same way, as, in my view at least, as you can manage a bacterial infection with an antibiotic, which gives you a sort of general way of dealing with infectious diseases, at least caused by bacteria. Because cancer isn't a single disease. It's probably 300-400 different diseases caused by different genetic mutations coming together that cause the cancer, often due to damage that occurs during the life of a person. And what that means is the treatments that you would think about for different cancers will be very different, one from another. There will be some commonalities, but many differences as well. So a consequence of that is that there will not be a single cure for cancer. There will be many different cures dealing with many different cancers. I use a metaphor here, really. It's like building a wall dealing with cancer. You're putting one brick on at a time. You don't suddenly build a tall wall. We're gradually going to build a wall, which over the years, probably decades, will gradually mean the majority of cancers will be controllable in some way. And I do think that, but there isn't going to be a magic cure next year. It's going to take decade after decade of painstaking research and the use of that research to develop treatments. And we will see gradually over the lifetimes of our children, our grandchildren, maybe our great-grandchildren, improvement in management and treatment of cancer. I have a final question. In your book, you suggest that the knowledge of life, both connected to us and connected in general to planet Earth, has also moral implications. Can you explain to us this concept?
Yes, I thought a bit about this, and I say it has moral implications for our relationship with life on our planet. And I make 2 points, really. The first I've already mentioned quite strongly. We interact and are dependent upon every living thing on this planet, or all living things on this planet interact and are dependent upon other living things. So our health, our life practices depend on having a healthy biosphere. So we have to respect other life forms because of that dependency. That's one thing. And then the second point is that we're related to all that life form because we've all evolved from a common ancestor. We're remarkably conserved and similar to even very distant organisms if we look at our DNA. So there is a relationship. And in a very strange sense, we're related to every living thing on the planet. And I work on yeast. It's a very simple organism. It diverged from human beings 1,500 million years ago, and yet we still control the reproduction of a yeast cell in the same way as we control the reproduction of a human cell. It's completely extraordinary. It's been the same for 1.5 billion years. And that means that living things are our relatives. So not only are we interacting and dependent upon every living thing, but they are in some sense our relatives. And therefore I make the case or make the argument that we have a responsibility for our life forms on this planet, for the biosphere. And as possibly the highest life form, I know we could argue about that, we have a responsibility for all our relatives. And in any case, we're dependent upon them. So that means we should respect them a great deal. We need to understand them to do that. And that's the moral argument I make, that there is a case for conserving our biosphere because we're related to everything and because we interact with everything.
It was a terrific conversation. Thank you very much, Sir Paul Nurse.
Thank you. A pleasure for me.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. See you soon.
I hope that was okay for you. Yes? Good. Okay.
Thanks. Perfect.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.